seeing all those children who were either born with severe disability or had been born to a mother who was using drugs, or they had been in some horrific accident that was not their fault, it makes you ask, why, God, why? And so I've had a lot of struggle with that over the years of seeing tremendous tragedy and having to find some hope in it. And so I've come to just accept God's plan. I cannot make sense of it. I don't have any answers for it, but I do believe there's no accident. There's no wasted life. Every child, no matter if we don't seem to see a potential there, God has a reason for that life. And my job is to try to help maximize their time here.
That's the voice of Ginny Cruz, a pediatric physical therapist who shares child development advice in her latest book, The New Mom's Guide, Hope and Help for Baby's First Year. In fact, hope and help are the themes of Cruz's service to others. As she has provided therapy to little ones with difficult physical and mental situations, Cruz has provided hope for recovery progress and hope through her faith in God. On today's Practical Faith Academy episode, I'll ask Cruz about her faith life, how she has sprinkled it into her work, and how her belief that God uniquely designs everyone with purpose has driven her service to families. I'm Cecil Taylor of Cecil Taylor Ministries, teaching Christians how to live a 7-day practical faith. Everything I do, whether blogs, books, videos, or this podcast, is about taking our faith from Sunday into the rest of the week, applying scripture and faith to life situations. I'm also interested in families, as I've written a book entitled Unison Parenting, the Comprehensive Guide to Navigating Christian Parenthood with One Voice. You can find more about the book and a special online sale in the podcast notes, as well as much more about my overall ministry and how it can help you. In the Practical Faith Academy podcast, I add other voices with other life experiences to understand how they put faith into practice. Please subscribe to my podcast according to your listening platform's instructions. Now let's bring Ginny Cruz onto the program. Followers of Cecil Taylor Ministries may recognize Ginny for her monthly column in the Unison Parenting newsletter and her monthly Diaper Days blog on unisonparenting.com and Cecil Taylor Ministries pages on Instagram and Pinterest. Ginny and I met at a Christian Writers Conference a couple of years ago, and with our common interest in children and families, we decided to work together. She has also been a helpful guide in my social media and marketing efforts. Ginny, it's good now to speak with you in a different format where we can talk about faith, as well as your new book for new moms. Welcome to the Practical Faith Academy.
Thank you, Cecil. It's nice to be here.
When I say 7-day practical faith, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think to me it means, trying to work your faith into your daily routine. And for me, obviously living out my faith, I'm doing that 7 days a week. But I find that I need to get in the Word and refresh myself every day, preferably in the mornings, because by the time I go through my day, I've lost my patience and all of those things when I'm out, with people or social media or whatever. And I find that it's getting in that Word every day.
Do you have a structure for how you do that? How do you really say get into the Word? Do you follow a particular Bible reading pattern, or you just do something random? What do you do?
I am just kind of go with the flow. I do get up every morning and read the verse of the day on my YouVerse app, share that on my social media, and then I do some social media posting on my Instagram and with some scripture. And so that kind of gets me started. And then usually I do try to spend time in the Word. I'm in 2 women's Bible studies right now at my church, and 2 churches actually, my church and another church. And so I'm reading and studying that every day. And so, but I'll get bored with things and I'll go do journaling for a while. But I have found that if I'm reading scripture or studying, that works for me.
Very good. Now let's get into a few things about your faith background, and also also we'll get into your book a little bit here in a moment. But you've said that you believe that every individual is uniquely designed by God to have purpose in their lives, and you want to help every child achieve maximum potential. What has fueled those beliefs for you?
I think what's fueled that belief for me started when I first started out in physical therapy, and primarily was working with children. And some of my first jobs, I was working in what's called an inpatient rehabilitation hospital, and also in a children's hospital. And so I saw, for lack of a better word, the worst of the worst. And so at that time, I had grown up in the church and was a believer, but had kind of had some church hurt. I guess that's the common phrase for it now, where I was kind of beginning to deal with my frustration with the hypocrisy I had seen in the church. I've come to realize now that those people were, I'm about as hypocritical as they were. So I have forgiven them and moved on and realized, they were being just people. But at that time, seeing all those children who were either born with severe disability or had been born to a mother who was using drugs, or they had been in some horrific accident that was not their fault, it makes you ask, why, God, why? And so I've had a lot of struggle with that over the years of seeing tremendous tragedy and having to find some hope in it. And so I've come to just accept God's plan. I cannot make sense of it. I don't have any answers for it, but I do believe there's no accident. There's no wasted life. Every child, no matter if we don't seem to see a potential there, God has a reason for that life. And my job is to try to help maximize their time here, make them as happy and as productive and as mobile as I possibly can. So that's kind of how I've come to it. But it's taken me decades of practice to get there.
Well, it's amazing how God has a purpose for every one of us every day in some way. No matter where you are, whatever circumstance you're in, however you're feeling, you could do something to glorify God every day and to be of service, no matter where you are. And it's certainly in the scenes that you were in, it's hard to see that at times. I'm sure, and people trying to get capable.
Yeah, I was sharing with I'm in a young moms group, or multi-generational moms group, and I was sharing with them, that don't underestimate your faith. How people watching. We were talking about people watching you. They were watching if they know you're a Christian, and of course they're looking to see if they can find some chink in the armor. Usually, but I said, when I was working in the children's hospital, it was there was no doubt which families were Christians in there, because they were the ones that were basically holding up other people. I mean, they were dealing with some horrible things, but they had pastors coming in. They had people coming in. They had all kind of support. They were doing prayers and whatever, and they were helping the nurses. And then you had the families where you might have a child that was in there and nobody ever came to see them. A baby. Nobody ever came.
Wow.
And so it was clear who the ones that they had something else. And you can't underestimate that people saw that, whether they talked to you or not, but they saw that, and that impacted them, hopefully in a positive way, that they realized that how did they find hope? Because this looks terrible. A child with cancer or whatever, it looks terrible.
Yeah, that reminds me of a girl I knew when I was in youth ministry who had cancer as a middle schooler. And one observation she made was when she would tell people that she had a pretty dreadful cancer and almost died from it. And if it was a person from her school, they would say something along the lines of, wow, that really stinks, or something worse. If she told somebody from church, they would say, how can I pray for you? What can I do for you? They would do more to lift her up instead of just saying, wow, that's terrible, you being over there with that. So, yeah, I can see that observation jibes with what I've seen. I wanted to talk about your new book for moms, and I got a chance to read it and review it, and I find it contains an interesting blend of approaches to child development. In much of the book, I see you making sure that mothers understand what is normal and set their expectations accordingly. But in other places, and then in the articles you do for the newsletter, I see you also clearly outlining the warning signs of when to escalate and get a medical professional involved. So talk a little bit about this blend and what in your background taught you this balance.
Well, I think that comes from having, evaluated so many children and dealing with parents and primarily mothers, and realizing that most mothers, at least the ones I've seen, go into having a baby without knowing anything about what they're doing. We're all going into it without an owner's manual. And I think that's more so today than it used to be, because a lot of women today did not grow up in big families. They were not babysitting. They weren't around children. And so they really don't know what their child is supposed to be doing. And it's really common for women to not realize their child is showing delay unless they're around other babies the same age. And since COVID, we don't see that very often at all. Women are not getting together in groups like they used to. They don't, many are still scared to go out. They're still scared to take their babies out. And so I try to let them know what their child should be doing. I did on one of my social media accounts one time, I asked a question: do you keep up with your baby's milestones on your own, or do you expect a pediatrician to do it? And practically all of them expected the pediatrician to do it, which shocked me. But maybe that's just me. I keep up with that stuff myself. I don't expect the doctor to just do everything, but it showed me that a lot of people just don't really know. They kind of know, but they don't really know. And so if they don't know what their child should be doing, what happens is when the child shows delays, it's been a while since they started showing that delay. Sometimes it can be a year or more. And then they realize, I need to do something about it. So I'm trying, for the people who are interested in learning about their child's development, catch this stuff earlier. Or when you start to have doubts, or concerns, or that mom instincts going, I think something's not right with my baby, talk to the doctor about it. Don't be talked out of it. Go ahead and address that. And to try to catch it early, because although it seems like there's not much going on with babies, there is so much going on with babies. Their foundation, their brain development, it's the foundation of everything else they're learning. And so when you go, and you know how much they're learning, like they go from not being able to sit up to sitting up in 6 months, right? 6 to 7 months, that's pretty fast development. But if you let that go for another year, you've lost a year. A child is already a year behind, possibly. So if you don't, like if they're not talking like they should, and you don't notice that till 2.5 years old, they are almost a year or more behind, and you may or may not catch up before they go to school.
Yeah, and then there's the opposite. I was very, very glad to have a book when I became a new dad 3.5 decades ago,
Yeah.
where basically a lot of the book was, it's normal. It's normal. It's normal. And I think you do that too, because you're trying to tell people what is normal. Because moms can also, or dads can over rotate on the other. Like, what's wrong? What's wrong? I don't have an owner's manual. The warning lights go off quickly for things that are very common.
Right.
And it's just a little variance in the kid, right?
Yeah. And I was trying to put that into the book as well, in some of the chapters of, it's just, some of this is just trial and error with children. You may think, there's something wrong because they're saying it this way, or they're doing this motor action this way. They're still on the learning curve. They're not precise with it like we are. We've been working at it for years, but it takes a while for your brain and your body to get connected to the point where those actions or those speech patterns or whatever have been refined to where they're almost perfect all the time. But babies, 1 minute that they're walking well, and all of a sudden they're falling. It's like, what's happening? Well, they may be going through a growth spurt. I mean, there's all kind of things that's going on with them that we just don't know, unless you know. And that's why I'm not trying to write a book like, I didn't try to write a book like the Mayo Clinic or some medical kind of book. I was just trying to write a book where it's more like conversations and short stories where they kind of begin to realize, just calm down a little bit. These are the things to look at. These are the things to not worry about. And, that's kind of my aim on the book.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about a special sale on my book, Unison Parenting. This book won the 2025 Independent Press Award for Parenting and Family, and it has been acclaimed as the most practical parenting book some have ever read. In it, I share parenting, faith development, and family management ideas that emerged from my 15 years of teaching 700 families at my church. Throughout the book, I show how parenting partners operating in unison can produce a unison family, where beloved children grow into mature adults who make good decisions. Unison Parenting is on sale at unisonfamily.com for just $10 instead of the $22.95 you'll find at the big bookseller sites. Check the show notes for the link and more information. I'm talking with Ginny Cruz here on the Practical Faith Academy podcast. And Ginny, you and I are both parents of adopted children. What have you learned from raising adopted children that might be useful for parents to know?
I think one thing I've learned, both of my sons were adopted from overseas. The oldest one we adopted at 17 months, and the second one we adopted at 11 months. And I think the thing I learned the most about that is that whether they're adopted or whether you have them, you really don't have as much, you have impact on them, but they're still wired a certain way. There's that nature versus nurture. And so it's amazing how, there's some things that you can alter by how you're raising them. But there's certain characteristics, their personality, whatever, that you really can't alter. Now, like our oldest son, he was also had what we would call in my business, had some sensory issues. He was very sensitive to sound. Like he would just, when you turn the vacuum cleaner on, he was screaming, bloody murder. The lawnmower, things like that, the hair dryer. And I've met a lot of families with children who are like that. He's a very, very structured person. He likes order. He's kind of a homebody kind of thing. But what I learned from him over the years, going back to this is the way he was wired, he ended up being a musician. Musicians are a different lot. Right? My mother used to say they're just different,
I live with one, I know.
They are, and they're very precise, right? I mean, so it's really funny that he was so sensitive auditorily to sound, but he ended up playing brass in a band. It's like, how do you go from you can't take the vacuum cleaner to playing the baritone?
Yeah.
I mean, but anyway, so I use that with parents a lot to let them know, your kid may have some quirks that may be their giftedness one day. That sensitivity now may be how they hear the difference in tone that I can't hear, whether something's off key or not, or, it's flat. And so, that was one thing. And then the younger son was a completely different personality. He's easygoing. I mean, obviously he was 6 months younger, but he had not been in as stable of an environment as the older one. So that could have been part of it. He was easier to go with people he didn't know, right? But he was the one that has ended up more in with a heart for the church work. He's working in banking right now, but his heart was to basically be a missionary.
Right. So they're all a box of chocolates, whether adopted.
They're all a box of chocolates. And I have, parents who've had children, have had their own children, and think that that their children are basically going to be like I've seen mothers who are like, well, I raised this child this way. And so they think they're being a really good parent. And then they basically give you free advice that you didn't ask for because their child is doing what your child's not doing. But then their next child comes along and it all goes out the window. Right.
Yeah.
So each child is their own personality. You have to adapt.
Well, now you've seen a lot of them as a pediatric physical therapist and as a childhood development specialist, and you've brought faith into those environments, I'm sure. How does your faith inform and infuse your work?
When you're doing pediatrics, oftentimes you're working with a child for a long time. When you're doing orthopedic work and physical therapy, like rotator cuff repair, if you're working with adults, you're working with them maybe 6 to 8 weeks. That's it. In pediatrics, you might work with them for years. So you develop a relationship with parents. And so I've had quite a few incidents where mothers would say, how do you stay positive about this? How do you see this turning out this way? Because I don't see it. How are we? Because the progress can be extremely small, very small, before you see what the layperson can say, yes, this child has made progress. And so I have had quite a few instances where I just share that with them. I have hope. My hope is that every child is here for a reason. This is not a punishment or an accident, whatever. It is what it is, but our job is to try to help get them to a higher level of function. And as long as they're making progress, we're still moving forward. I had one particular incident that happened. I had a child I was working with that had severe cerebral palsy. So both arms, both legs, the whole body was impaired. And so she couldn't, she was like a toddler, like a year and a half. She couldn't even sit up. So she was, over a year delayed in her skills. And, but they were Muslim. They were from Saudi Arabia. They were here. I don't know their whole story, but they were Saudis. And so anyway, I was working with them one time, and the mother said, she was one of the ones that was asking me, how do you stay hopeful? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, in my culture, this child is a curse. She's a curse on our family because she's handicapped.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I don't view it that way. My God, I don't believe that. I believe that every child has purpose, blah, 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 whatever. Went through the whole spiel. And so anyway, she just sort of sat there and looked at me like, I don't know what to make of that. And I said, well, let me just ask you this. If you don't believe that there's hope, why do you bring her? Right.
Right.
So I knew already, woman to woman, that she had hope that child was going to get better. So if it was a curse, why didn't you just accept the curse and stay home and hide from society, which is what her husband wanted her to do? And she didn't truly believe that because she would not have brought the child for therapy.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's the way I interpreted it. And so I never saw her again because 9/11 happened, the next appointment, and they were in the waiting room, and I was going out there to get them, and we had the radio on in the waiting room and heard about the plane crashes, and they got up and left. And I never saw them again. But things like that have come up over the years, I don't proselytize, obviously, in my job, but I have an opportunity to say, well, I don't believe that. This is where I get my faith from and my hope, and just plant seeds.
Right. I'll jump in here to share a bit about my 2 websites and what they offer. On CecilTaylorMinistries.com, you'll find my 7-day practical faith blog, my podcast library, and my award-winning books for individuals and book and video studies for churches and small groups. So there are free and paid options for developing your faith life. You can sign up for my free newsletters on the homepage and hire me as a speaker for your church or small group on my speaking page. At my parenting site, unisonfamily.com, you'll find my Unison Parenting blog, to which Jenny contributes as a guest writer each month. Both of us and other parenting experts contribute to my free Unison Parenting monthly newsletter. You can sign up for that on the homepage of unisonfamily.com. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also learn more about my book, Unison Parenting, and take advantage of a 60% off sale. If all that went by fast, just read through the show notes below the podcast. They contain all the info you need to help develop your faith and your family. Continuing the conversation now with Ginny Cruz and written a children's fiction, a children's nonfiction, a family memoir of stories that taught you faith over the years. And that one caught my attention because it has this compelling title of Mud, Holes and Magnolias, which somehow seems like a good title for a Mississippi girl.
Yeah.
So tell us about one of the faith lessons from that book.
My mother had her family. This is about her family. And they were storytellers. They were all either teachers or preachers. They were storytellers. And, they grew up in Mississippi. They were farm people, just like most of the people at that time. And so I remember just sitting at their feet on the porch, listening to these stories for years and years and years. And Mother had always told me she wanted to write them down because nobody was writing them down and people were passing away. And so she wanted to write them down, but she never was able to do that. And then she developed Parkinson's dementia and all of that. And after she passed, about a year or so later after that, I felt God saying, you just need to write those stories down. And when I started writing them, I realized I could not write them because they weren't my stories. And so after a lot of prayer, I realized that, I had learned faith lessons from all those stories. Because I reflected back, God showed me I had reflected back to different parts of my life where something had happened maybe, and I had remembered, grandmother went through this, which was much worse than what I'm going through. So I can get through this, right? And so that's kind of how I wrote the stories, to where they had a faith, what the lesson I had taken from them.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I find that some people will write a book that is just about their family and about their history or about their stories or whatever. And maybe that's the only book they ever write, but they want to capture that. And so it's good that you did that, but you also had to process it your own way, right? Because you couldn't tell the story the same way. I can understand that. So I've been trying to capture some of our family stories the same way.
They were much better storytellers than I am, but my work weavers group there was one of the ones that helped me come up with this title, because that was my working title. And then I had pitched another title. I was bringing it to critique, and I had another title, which I don't even remember now. And they were like, you need to publish this book. What's your title? And I told them, and it was Marilyn Turk, who we both know. And she goes, that's not really a good title. And of course, when you have a good critique group, you take that in love, like, you're right, it's not a good title. And so I said, well, my working title was this, which was Mud, Holes and Magnolias. And they're like, you got to call it that. And I was like, because they lived out on a dirt road, they lived out in some of the lowlands of Mississippi, and that part of the country it's the Magnolia State. So there's magnolia trees and mud. So there you go. Mud, Holes and Magnolias.
Well, I want to pivot during the last part of our time together to a couple of faith questions. What's the hardest part about putting faith into practice for you?
For me, it is letting God take total control, because I am a control person. And I've always been a doer, a list maker, check the boxes, and make a plan, work the plan. And then my job is that way too. You figure out what can you do and let's do it. And so letting God take total control, that's the hardest thing for me, because that, you're like, well, but what if this happens? What if that happens? because I like to be prepared. So letting go, that's the hardest thing.
Let go, let God, and what a ride we have in our
Trust.
lives.
Yeah, just trust.
So, for our listeners, what's the best tip you have for them for developing and maintaining their 7-day practical faith?
I would say for is to make a regular habit of reading the Bible every day. I think one thing I learned through my life and raising children, getting out of that small town in Mississippi and realizing that the world is nothing like what you grew up with. Because I grew up in what could have been called Mayberry RFD. I mean, it was a very innocent place to grow up compared to the world. But the thing I find most people struggle with is they don't really read the Bible. They read what somebody said about the Bible, or they listen to what somebody said about the Bible, but they're not reading the Bible. And I thank God every day that I grew up in a Bible believing, reading church. And my parents, my grandmother, I remember her saying, I had an aunt who married a Catholic, which of course was like, oh my God, we were Baptists. So it's like, oh my God, that was a long time ago. But in those days, it was like, you don't do that. But anyway, she and my uncle, who was Catholic, would have arguments, civil arguments on the porch about, Catholicism and blah, blah, blah. And I remember her saying one time, you don't need to go through the Pope. You just need to read the Bible and pray yourself. It says it right there. Things like that stuck in my mind. And I realized a lot of people really don't read the Bible. And they don't know that whatever they're being told, okay, that's not how I read it, right? Or I've never read that in the Bible, or that's not my interpretation of or you took that out of context. And so I think reading that Bible every day, getting in there and studying it, and preferably with a small group of people that you can bounce things off of, is the best way to really, really, build your faith, is to know what's in that Bible.
Well, I give a hearty amen to what you just said. I feel like a lot of times, you can be misled by somebody who is, and maybe they have good intentions, but they've read the Bible a particular way, maybe without challenge. And if you have not read it yourself, you just accept it as fact. You're not sure what's actually in there. People are kind of scared of the Bible, I think. They don't know how to go about reading it in the first place. So I think, and the other thing that I've found is that by engaging regularly, you see the Bible in fresh ways,
Oh, yeah.
because where you are in life, a verse may strike you completely differently now than it did when you were younger or when you weren't going through what you're going through now. The Bible is so multifaceted. It's so deep that it is possible to interpret it in different ways, and that may be okay depending on what you can extract out of it for where you're living your life today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the older I've gotten, I've realized, to give grace to people. They may say something, and I'm like, well, that's not right. But where they are in life, that may be where they're interpreting it. And I might have interpreted it that way when I was younger too. And you get older and you see things differently. And the more you read it, the more you see, which is one of the most maybe the most fascinating thing about the Bible. So I've offered grace to people more than I used to. But I would just say to people, you need to get a good Bible and watch your translation. Look at different translations, but you need to not just go to church or listen to a sermon and just take it at face value. You really need to be in that word yourself. And my grandmother, who, like I said, she was like a faith leader in our family. She only had an 8th grade education. But she used to say, the Bible is there for you. If you can read it, you can understand it. God will show you what you need to learn from it. You don't have to have a college degree. Now, obviously, if you have a college degree or divinity degree, then you know more, which is wonderful. But you don't have to have that to get the basics of the Bible, to me.
Ginny, it's been such a pleasure having you on. Tell our listeners how they can follow you and find your books.
Well, the book is on Amazon. And then my website is ginnycruz.com. It's GINNYCRUZ.com. And so you can get the books there. And then I also have a Facebook group called Tummy Time Prayers. And that I developed earlier this year. And basically, it's just a closed group there. In other words, you have to request to be in it, that kind of thing. So we don't have just whatever, don't want a lot of spam and all that. But there I offer like a morning scripture and prayer prompt for them, and some other tips and some, things that you don't necessarily get on my other social media. And so that has been growing pretty nicely too. And I have a lot of moms on there and grandmoms who got grandbabies and have forgotten what it's like to have a baby around. And so things are different now.
Well, very good, Ginny. Listeners, please check the show notes. We'll put that information in there as well to remind you. And Ginny, it's been such a pleasure. It's always great to talk to you and to work with you, and to have you on the podcast today is really special. And we're at Christmas time, so want to wish you a Merry Christmas as well.
Thank you. Merry Christmas to you. And thank you, Cecil. Good to see you.
I'm so blessed to know and work with Ginny Cruz, and I'm so glad we could work it out for her to join me for the Practical Faith Academy. I mentioned earlier that there are even more ways to benefit from my ministry. Subscribe to this podcast. Follow Cecil Taylor Ministries on Facebook, Instagram, or Pinterest. But be sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletters, Ministry Connection and Backstage Pass. They combine practical faith tips with updates on the ministry and on my life as well. Read about them in the show notes and how you can receive them. As the calendar turns to January and we encounter a new year, we bring our hopes and our fears. I'll be joined on the next Practical Faith Academy episode by Rebecca Gray, author of a new extensive devotional book on conquering your fears through the God who understands our fear. The episode will come available in the first half of January. For a reminder, please subscribe to my podcast before you go. Until next time, remember, God sends you into the world every day.